Last time we looked at the physiology of taste and how your taste system works. This set of notes is going to look at the biological factors that are involved in eating and hunger. And some of it is from the textbook reading that we did, the assignment with the questions, and some of it is new. So let's get going. One of the most basic things that our bodies do to satisfy our hunger is to actually chew our food, believe it or not. Simply the act of chewing helps to satisfy your hunger. Therefore, doesn't it make sense that eating something that requires you to chew it more would lead to you feeling more satisfied, as opposed to eating something, like if you're eating pudding, for example, that would be less satisfying. And this explains why when people try these liquid diets where they replace their meals with, say, like a shake or something, these are pretty unsuccessful over the long term because people can't stick to that and they're simply not satisfying. Another factor is the stomach. When it comes to the stomach, many of us, if not all of us, can relate to the idea that those kind of grumbling in the stomach that accompanies hunger, well, those are called contractions. They're the muscles in your stomach. And those can produce feelings of hunger. And we know this from a really old study. It goes back to 1912, where they had volunteers, if you can believe it, they had volunteers to do this. They had a tube placed down their esophagus, and there was a balloon on the end of it. And they were to press a button whenever they felt a hunger pang. So the researchers would simulate your stomach contractions by inflating the balloon. Their idea was, if these actually cause hunger, those hunger contractions that we feel, then the person should feel hunger when they inflate the balloon, whether or not they're hungry or not. Whether or not they're truly hungry, just the sensation of that balloon being inflated and feeling like a stomach contraction can lead to hunger. And that's actually what happened. People really did feel hungry, and they pressed that button when the balloon was inflated, even though they weren't necessarily literally biologically hungry. The stomach does some other things that are pretty wild too. It can tell the brain, not with words, obviously, you know that, but it can tell the brain how full it is. So your brain gets signals from your stomach. But here's the deal. Your brain doesn't get the message from the stomach for a while. So by the time your brain processes that you are full, your stomach is already beyond that point, and you're going to feel all bloated. So the idea is to eat before you completely feel full. How much nutrient is present is another factor that the stomach can relate to the brain. And rich foods that have a lot of protein or carbohydrates, they can actually satisfy hunger quicker than the same amount of volume. So if you had like a cup of water versus a cup of food, same amount of volume, but rich food would actually make you feel less hungry than just simply chugging water of the same amount. Another factor that was described in the chapter is your hypothalamus. The hypothalamus works sort of like an on-off switch for eating. We saw this, psychology students saw this in the brain and behavior, biology and behavior unit when we studied what the different structures do. And you might remember these photos. In each picture, the rat on the right, the really large rat, he had the part of his brain that tells him to stop eating, he had that damaged surgically, and that led him to overeating, and he became more than twice the size of a normal sized rat. Now, another important factor when it comes to eating and weight maintenance and feeling hungry has to do with a concept that was discovered around 25 years ago in the mid 90s. It's called the set point theory. And what is it? The set point theory answers this question: why is it that repeated dieting is so unsuccessful for long-term changes? How come so many people go on diets only to gain the weight back? Well, this theory helps to explain this. It shows what's going on in the body. So your set point that's basically the weight that a person's going to keep, the weight that they maintain when they're not trying to lose weight or gain weight. That kind of just your baseline weight. Think of it that way. And everyone has a different one. Think of your set point as being similar to a thermostat, only instead of a thermostat for heat, it's a thermostat for fat levels. When you set the temperature on your thermostat at home for, let's say, 70 degrees, when the temperature in your house drops below 70, the thermostat tells your heating system to kick on to bring it back up to 70. When the temperature goes over 70, it tells the heat to turn off. Well, your body has a similar process, only instead of for heat, it's for how much fat you have. And that's what your set point does. So imagine your set point being like a point on this thermometer here. And imagine it goes down. All right. Maybe you maybe you were sick and you lost a little weight, or for whatever reason you lost a few pounds over a period of time, and now you're down. Well, how does your body get you to return to the set point? It does so through hunger. It causes you to be hungry. When your weight goes below your set point, hunger kicks in and you wind up gaining weight. It's your body's way of making you maintain your set point. So that's when it goes down. That's when it drops below the set point. What about when you gain a little weight? If you gain some weight, your brain is going to get the signal, and you're going to be basically feeling the need to eat less. So when your weight is at or above your set point, like in that picture, in that illustration, that means your fat levels are okay. You have enough fat, because you need to have fat. It's essential. And when your weight is above your set point, your body releases the hormone leptin. And leptin is a hormone that signals the body to eat less. Leptin was discovered in the mid-90s, and they did some studies with it using rats. And rats that were given leptin ate less. Rats that were not given leptin became obese. And the only difference was one rat got leptin, one didn't. So why not just give this to humans? Well, it's not possible. They have not come up with a way to do that with humans yet. Leptin is released by your fat cells, and essentially it decreases eating and speeds up your metabolism. So why do some people, though, continue to gain weight? If this is telling us that you start to eat less when your body weight goes above the set point, shouldn't people who are obese kind of not be that way? Shouldn't their bodies tell them to eat less? Well, this is what happens. Some people, and this is not to say all people who are obese are resistant to leptin, but some people are resistant to leptin. It's as if leptin puts on the stop sign to stop eating, to eat less, but some people's bodies don't follow the system, don't follow that message. It doesn't work in everyone. So what determines your set point? Why do we all have different set points? Part of it's our genes and what we inherit. If you want to know a really good predictor of how much people will weigh, it's to look at their parents' weights. That's pretty strongly correlated. So we look at genes. We also look at early eating patterns. And if this kind of sounds familiar, it's nature versus nurture. Nature in the genes, nurture in your early eating patterns. So the way you eat when you're little, especially when you're like a little kid, it's going to very likely have an effect on you long into your adult life. Another thing that can affect your set point is physical activity. Physical activity seems to be able to lower people's set points. And as I was saying with early eating patterns, overweight children often become adults with more fat cells and larger fat cells. So let's take a look now at how fat cells work, because that's another piece to this puzzle. There's so many different factors involved here that all kind of work together and depend on each other. So fat cells are like balloons that hold fat. Instead of holding air, they hold fat. And the number of fat cells you have is generally going to be determined by the time you are late adolescence. And that's usually, think of it around age 20-ish. Adolescence, by the way, isn't just like your teenage years. Most psychologists define adolescence even into the early 20s. So we can determine our fat cell levels by late adolescence, and overeating probably creates more. There's probably a good chance that if you overeat, you will create more fat cells. So this particular comparison of fat cells shows three different people. The one on the left, this is a person who was never obese. So just take a look at the number of fat cells there and the size of them. And then we have the next one, an obese person. The fat cells are bigger and there's more of them. And the one on the right, kind of weird that the fat cells look smaller. This is to simulate an obese person after they lose weight. So the fat cells have shrunk, but they haven't gone away. They're still there. And here's why. Because losing weight never makes fat cells go away. It only shrinks them. Fat cells never vanish when you lose weight. They only shrink. And the only way to get rid of fat cells is literally to suck them out of your body with liposuction. It's the only way. Here is an illustration of this idea of fat cell shrinking. So, person has a starting weight. Those are the person's just kind of representing their fat cells. All right, and then they gain weight, so they add more fat cells to their system. And then they lose weight, and those fat cells kind of shrink. I made them kind of look like pancakes. And then they regain the weight, but now they're worse off than they were before they lost the weight, because look, now they have, think of it as you've inflated your fat cells and they've added on even more fat cells. So when you lose weight and then gain weight back, you can be worse off than before you gain weight in the first place. Because you can add fat cells, but you can never lose them. By the way, when you lose weight, you ever wonder where your weight goes? When a person loses weight, where does it go? And surprisingly, this concept or this fact, the answer to this question was only really discovered, I think, like 6 or 7 years ago. It was either 2014 or 2015 that someone actually, or some researchers actually studied this. Basically, the vast majority of the weight you lose is breathed out as CO2. When you breathe, there's actually atoms and molecules that come out, and that's over, if you have enough of it, it's going to weigh something. Smaller amounts are converted to water and energy, but the vast majority is going to be carbon dioxide. Now, our last topic here in the biological factors section has to do with the idea of people eating food and being unable to stop. So we're going to look at this question: can food be addictive? Can food be addictive? These are 3 simulations of brains that show activity levels in different areas. On the left, you see what would be normal brain activity. In the middle is someone who is addicted to cocaine, and they are watching a video of cocaine use. And then on the one on the right, this is an obese person watching a video of people eating. And you can see that they're very similar. So we're going to look at the details of just how food is addictive and how it can be. But let's take a look first at a popular food product and how it is basically engineered and designed to get you to eat more than you should. And basically, I'm talking about Doritos. And I don't pick on Doritos for any reason other than that they're very popular. They're one of the most popular salty snack foods in this country. And very little about the Dorito is left to change, or left to chance. There are very few coincidences with Doritos. Salt activates your reward system. And a small 2-ounce bag has 20% of your daily salt intake. So that's giving your brain a major reward. The color of it, that orangey color, food scientists, and that's actually a type of job. Food scientists design food in laboratories. They study the colors of food, and there's a lot of evidence that people are drawn to these bright colors. And that powder that gets all over your fingers, well, when you eat the Dorito, that cheesy powder gets all over your taste buds even more, and it makes you lick your fingers, which gives yet another burst of flavor to the brain. You tend to salivate more, you drool more when you eat things like Doritos because they have lactic acid and citric acid that makes you produce saliva, and that is a cue to eat more. If you keep chewing a Dorito, eventually it's going to start melting down into like a paste, and when fatty snacks start to melt away like that, your brain stops registering that as calories and you just keep eating. And then finally, fat is yet another substance that your brain sees as a reward. So what 3 aspects of the standard American diet, and that by standard I mean the one that most people eat, which 3 aspects most help promote overeating and obesity? 3 things: sugar, fat, and variety. The amount of sugar, the amount of fat, and the fact that there is a lot of variety in foods. Variety leads people to overeat. Now, we're going to take a look at just what's going on in the brain and why it's a fact that you can become addicted to certain foods. This is not to say that all food is addictive and everyone becomes addicted to food. No, definitely not true. But some food is addictive to certain people. Obviously, we need food, and everyone eats, but not everyone is addicted to food. It has to do with how much you eat, what you eat. So when people who eat lots of sugar regularly, some of those folks are going to become addicted to sugar, just like they might get addicted to a drug of abuse like cocaine or heroin. And you'll start to see similar responses, just like in an addict, a drug addict. So people will need more and more sugar in order to get the same effect. They will need more and they will feel lousy when they don't have it. They'll have withdrawal symptoms. And they'll feel better when they take it again. So they'll build up a tolerance. They'll have withdrawal symptoms, just like if they had an addiction to a drug. So let's see how this works. The word palatable, we need to define this first. If a food is palatable, it simply means it has a pleasant taste. It's agreeable to us. All right. So like an apple is palatable, a carrot is palatable, things like that. But the foods that people become addicted to are not simply palatable. And there's a new word that researchers have had to kind of come up with, and that is hyper-palatable. Hyper-palatable foods are literally designed to be addictive. And they do this by the use of 3 things that go into most addictive foods: fat, salt, and sugar. And they will test out different levels of fat, a little bit more, a little bit less. Same thing with salt and sugar. And find out where the sweet spot is, no pun intended, for how much they need to put in of each one to get the most people kind of hooked on it. Now, this next part you might find pretty surprising. I certainly did when I learned this. Opioids. We all know what those are, right? Opioids are things like heroin and OxyContin. But your brain actually produces natural opioids. And these hyperpalatable foods cause the release of these opioids in your brain. They're naturally there. Hyperpalatable foods release these opioids and it makes you feel pleasurable. So if you eat people who are addicted to sugar and they eat a lot of sugar, they're going to feel really good. They're going to get high off of it practically. And the problem is this feeling of pleasure can basically override the fact that you're full, and then people just keep on eating. So there's that. There's the opioid factor. All right. You eat food that's hyperpalatable and it makes you feel pleasure. There's also the influence of dopamine. Dopamine is triggered when you eat hyperpalatable foods. Food is a reward, and rewards trigger dopamine. All right? And hyperpalatable foods make you release more dopamine. Rewards become linked to other stimuli. So the time of day that you eat can be a cue. The place you're at, like you have to have popcorn at the movie theater. You have to eat when you're like sitting in front of the television. Events like parties or hanging out at your grandmother's house or whatever. So these different stimuli, whether it's the time of day or where you are, These things can trigger dopamine on their own, and dopamine drives you to seek food. Dopamine doesn't give you the pleasure. Dopamine makes you seek food. Dopamine is a motivator. It makes you remember pleasurable things. Opioids are what give you the pleasure, and dopamine makes you remember that. So here's how it all works. You get the cue, like meaning you see the food. Okay, that's what we mean by cue. And dopamine gets released. All right, so you're sitting in front of the TV. That's your cue. Your brain releases dopamine because you've done it so many times before, and that gives you the drive to seek food. And then you eat. And when you eat, what happens? Opioids get released. And what do opioids cause? Pleasure. And what does pleasure do? It makes you not notice you're full and you keep eating. And then that continues. That pleasure becomes its own cue, and the pleasure keeps you eating. You don't notice you're full, and the cycle continues. And by the end, you've overeaten. Okay, so that is all for these notes, and we will continue next time with some of the psychological factors. Okay, so thank you for watching.